They had a lot of people also over for dinner.
Yeah.
I was speaking at a synagogue.
Yeah, Nate said he raised quite a bit of money for the AAEJ, always was very generous himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Leave any money in the will, do you know?
To the AAEJ? Not that I know of, but I never asked that question. And Will Recant didn't tell me. He would have told me. Do you know who Arthur Goldberg is in New York City? Not the author.
He's sending us $3,000 a year.
Well, he not only sends it every year, but any time I send him an invitation to a benefit or call him, he sends another check for $3,000. He's sent 3 of them so far this year.
3 this year?
In '88.
Now, he's a member of the Sephardic Synagogue.
And he's a member of New Berger and Goldman law firm.
Never met him.
How did he get involved with us? Whose friend is he?
The rabbi of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue.
Rabbi Mark Angel. Oh, I see. We're all set. Okay, good. You going to be okay? Do you take a break or anything? Because I told you about Carl.
I take funerals. I've got to speak it tonight at a party. They're sitting Shiva. I've got to give a kind of a second eulogy on a man tonight.
Okay. All right.
I'll think about it later.
All right.
Carl, make a note. Carl Cabot, Emma, died. You remember we met him that time when he gave us that VCR that I sold for $300.
Do we need to unplug the phone by any chance? Or what if the phone rings in the middle of all this? Robert, what do you think?
You can, if it's okay, you can unplug it. If you need to hear a call, then we'll stop the interview. It's entirely up to you guys.
Did you hear the phone that rang just now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we'll hear everything that goes on.
Emma, you can turn it. Do you know how to turn it down so it's a very low signal?
Okay. So Graneum, all these years I've been listening to you speak, and you wrote your autobiography a few years ago. But tell me again, back in 1955, when you first visited Ethiopia to learn about the Ethiopian Jewish community, Tell me. Tell me.
Are we on?
Yeah, don't worry about all that. You're just going to talk to me for a while.
In '55, I didn't visit Ethiopia.
What did you do?
'55 is when I met the first Ethiopian Jews. We were in Israel. Emma and I were in Israel, and with a tour of some 30 social workers and Jewish educators for a period of 6 weeks. One of the places we visited was Kfar Batya, which is supported by the American Women's Mizrahi organization. And there were 13 youngsters from Ethiopia there. They had arrived only in recent months to study in preparation for the return to Ethiopia, where they would be teachers in Hebrew, modern Judaism, that is modern traditional Judaism, of course. And something about other aspects of the economy in which they might make a contribution from what they had learned in Israel. I took pictures with them, with a group. That aroused my curiosity. I wanted to know much more about them. Even though I had heard about Ethiopians, Jews, or falashas as they were then called, I was later the person who started the movement to call them Ethiopian Jews and drop the term falasha, which is essentially a pejorative term. It's something that they don't call themselves. You know, they call themselves Beta Israel, the house of Israel. And nobody seemed to want to answer any of the queries that I made. How many there were,
Who did
what
you
we
ask?
were doing for them.
Who did you ask? What queries?
Well, I asked the officials who were from the Israeli government Jewish agency who were associated with our mission, spoke to us every day of the week. Most of them seemed to know nothing about it, or if they did, they certainly didn't give me any answers. The first real answer that I got that summer was when, on a Saturday morning after shul was over, we went to the home of the chief Ashkenazic rabbi, Rabbi Herzog, the father of the current president of the state of Israel. For the first half hour of that morning, beginning at 11 o'clock, there was nobody else there except Emma and myself. And so we had a chance to talk to him on many things. And then I brought up the issue of what is the world doing about Ethiopian Jews. And he told me that he was very much interested in them, and he had written a memorandum about them. He had asserted that they were Jews and that they should be eligible to come into Israel and live like anybody else. And that satisfied my inquiry that morning, but it didn't thereafter. And I might say that for the next 10 years, I besought answers to all kinds of questions about their numbers, their problems, and why many more of them were not in Israel. In fact, in 1955, there was only one Ethiopian Jew who was actually living in Israel.
Who was that?
He was a student of Dr. Jacques Feitlovich. I'm trying to think of his name.
That wasn't Fittegute Desse, was it? Who later became the ambassador to Rome?
No. Well, I don't know why it disappears from my memory at the moment. But he was there. He had been a very important official in the government, but found no opportunity to advance after the war. Part of Haile Selassie's court, because he was a very well-educated Jew, having been brought to Europe and Palestine and even into America in the intervening years, so that he was much better intellectually endowed than most of the Ethiopians.
Where is he now?
He's dead. He died in Israel, I believe, 1968-69. I think the story is, I have the story in my book Graneum, which you have read. So when I never got a satisfactory answer as to their numbers or what had been done for them or what their needs were, and there was an organization known as the American Falasha Society, which had been in existence since 1922, but it was raising very, very little money for them over the course of years. They had some people who had gone to Ethiopia and were endeavoring to assist them, but basically very little was done for them because there was no organization, certainly on a worldwide basis, like HIAS or the Joint Distribution Committee or the World Jewish Congress, who showed any concern about their welfare.
Did you go talk to those places, HIAS, Joint Distribution Committee?
I had written to all of them and gotten very, very unsatisfactory answers, including World ORT. It turned out that some studies had been made about their welfare, and but nothing had been done to fulfill their need for for either freedom to leave the country or to be given property or farmland which they could use and develop for themselves in communities where they could also continue their ancient culture.
Okay, Graneum, why do you think that was? From all those years, and you eventually founded your own organization, why was it that other organizations gave you unsatisfactory responses or did very little?
My suspicion was that they were poor, they were uneducated, They were unskilled, and possibly because they were black. Now those are 4 negative, which are hardly an asset. And Israel at that time, obviously, was looking for the technologically competent, people who were reasonably self-sufficient, people who could bring money into the country itself, people whom they wouldn't have to spend the better part of a year educating in order to accommodate them to the development of the country. They were looking for a different kind of individual than perhaps the Ethiopians could provide, but I didn't know that for sure until I went there. And when we went there for the first time in 1965 and spent several weeks in Ethiopia, most of it visiting the villages at close range, taking innumerable pictures, talking to their leaders, talking to the young people, some of whom could speak English. Many of them could also speak Hebrew, particularly those who had spent years studying at Kfar Batya in Israel itself. I got some feeling of what the country was like. It's a beautiful country, even though even then, in '65, it was gradually being denuded of its trees, as the poor had to cut them down in order to provide the charcoal in order to cook their daily meals. As they killed off the wild animals, and I understand that there were as many wild animals there as you would find in Kenya and in Tanzania or in Uganda, because they needed them actually to feed themselves. It was a country with a per capita annual income some $65 a year. The average lifespan was 38 years. There was one doctor for over 125 or 150,000 people, if you could find that one doctor. He probably was ill-trained. Most of the people who were serving them medically were what they called dressers, had about the equivalent of a practical nurse in any American community, in any American hospital. It was a barefoot culture. They lived in mud huts. They slept on the ground. If they had any money which they had accumulated at all, they would put a tin roof on instead of a thatched roof over their home, or they might even import a bed with a mattress. It's true, the conditions even under that kind of a tin roof hut were still primitive. But there was a eagerness, a desire, a zeal to maintain their own village continuity and independence, and also to sustain their own culture. I met their Kassim, their priests. They don't have rabbis. As a matter of fact, 30 of them came to Ambober in their white shamas and their white turban hats with their prayer shawls, but with their bare feet, and came to the synagogue and gave me a letter addressed to the President of Israel, requesting that they be lifted up on the wings of angels, like their brethren across the Red Sea in Yemen, only a few years before that, and brought to Israel the land of their prayers over the millennia. I delivered the letter subsequently. I don't know whatever happened to it. I'm sure that no action, obviously, was taken. This is my entrance into my concern for their welfare. I had never in my wildest dreams ever thought that I would get involved in this. I needed no more causes. I had too many tasks that I had to perform in my job at Federation, which consumed the better part of, I would say, 10 to 12 hours a day, and very often 6 days a week.
Tell me more about that. You had, by this time in 1965, you'd had a long career already as Jewish communal executive. As you say, you were involved in many causes. And at this point in your life, you had already been labeled a dangerous radical, hadn't you? What made you take on another and obviously fairly unpopular cause, or a cause that the Jewish community was uninterested in?
Well, being a dangerous radical,
Were you a dangerous radical then?
it was
How
hardly
did you
that.
get to be labeled a dangerous radical, Graneum?
Well, that went way back at almost the beginning of my career in Staten Island, when I was tied up with the programs for against poverty in the midst of the Depression, and I was head of a housing, one of the first housing committees to get better housing for people. And I was chairman of the National Youth Administration Committee on the island, one of the first parts of all of America that set in motion a program to defend them. But I was also interested in, or had been interested in what was going on in Spain with respect to the overthrow of the democratic government by the tyrannical regime. I was interested in birth control, and I brought people who espoused that particular cause at that time. I brought outstanding economists and speakers to the institution who were always on the fringe of the radical movements, none of them communist, but nonetheless, when you're associated with things like birth control or Republican Spain, or you're in housing and you're in the arts and you're in working with always with the poor, obviously you have the taint of radicalism on you, and I inherited that. And when I went on to Staten Island, and from Staten Island on to the Bronx house, it was right in the midst of a very, very poor neighborhood, which I was always trying to improve, whether it was in housing, whether it was in streets, whether it was in better police protection, whether it was trying to improve the quality of the local schools, whether it was dealing with the blacks who were just beginning to move into that section of the community, bringing in outstanding black artists and singers and dramatic people into the settlement house to teach the white community what blacks were actually like there. All of these things had a radical tinge. And so I got a reputation, by and large, of being with causes which were generally unpopular.
How did you feel about that?
Never bothered me in the least. It kept me from achieving perhaps higher positions there, but it didn't keep me from fulfilling these programs. I developed, in those days, the first interracial settlement house in the Bronx there, which was later incorporated within the school system. I developed a program for the aged, the first recreational program for the aged in this country, back in 1943. When nobody was interested in, nobody wanted to devote any time or energy to the age of the community. I developed all kinds of camp programs and brought into these camps not only blacks, some blacks, along with it was essentially a white and a Jewish camp, but I brought in the partially sighted, hard of hearing, sometimes individuals with serious emotional problems, because I believe that some of these youngsters could function much better if they were in an environment. These things were considered radical. Also in a period when everybody was hell-bent for assimilation, I was trying to make the Bronx house, which had been kind of a non-sectarian settlement, although primarily for Jews. I was trying to make it a Jewish agency with a Hebrew school, with Friday night programs, Saturday afternoon programs, and to celebrate all of the Jewish festivals that took place year-round, concerned with the new Sephardic community which is growing up in that area, which again, nobody literally was interested in.
The Sephardic community.
Sephardic community. This again was in the early 40s. So you can see that these are the things which brand you as being a radical in the sense that you are not a conformist.
Well, Graneum, if this was your...
Excuse me, that's a good time. We have to change tape.
Okay. Does that take a long time?
No.
2 seconds.
You have to change one?
Tape. Each tape is just 20 minutes.
Just a rewind.
Oh my God, we haven't even started.
I will. We're going to get into all that. Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you, what made you persist in pursuing these programs? I mean, I'm sure you thought they were for people's good and necessary, and yet if the organizations you work for and the community that you were trying to serve didn't want them, didn't appreciate them, and asked you to drop it, what made you persist? You had job at stake, you had reputation at stake. I'm sure you didn't want to be branded an extremist, a radical. How did you know it was the right thing to do, to pursue birth control, to pursue integration, to pursue helping the handicapped and the aged?
Well, I've always been endowed with kind of a curious bent ever since I was a child. And of course, being curious can lead you into adventures of one kind or another, which come upon you. And once it came upon me that here was a problem, or here was an interesting thing that perhaps was good for more people, and certainly the disadvantaged group in our society. I always felt that I had an obligation to do something about it. And then I kind of thought that maybe I had a foresight, if you will, a prophetic instinct. And once you have a feeling of that nature, you think that you're right. Sometimes it's based upon a lot of knowledge. Sometimes it's based only upon a hunch. You want to finish it and see whether you can bring that into being. That's how recreational programs for the aged came into being. That's why camps began to open their doors to all kinds of handicapped people of every kind and description, largely from the example that was set there. Training programs that we introduced in Bronx House for professionals. We were the first agency that actually employed full-time professionals to lead groups on the most basic elementary level. There became standard practice, well, maybe 5, 10, 15 years later. Same way that Jewish programs in community centers. There was a period when Jewish programs had been practically abandoned. They were a peripheral aspect. We were primarily recreational centers, at best cultural centers on a rather low cultural level. There weren't educational institutions. When I recognized that most Jews were ignorant of their Jewish experience, and except for those who were immensely and intensely religiously identified, I thought the Jewish Community Center ought to be the instrument for bringing that into being. I ran into the most serious headwinds from my fellow professionals, from the heads of organizations and institutions, both lay and precisely because of that.
Because of what?
Because they felt that we were primarily a cultural, recreational, and social work institution, and not a Jewish educational institution. I'm happy to say that in the year 1987 and 88, even the Jewish Welfare Board finally got around to declaring that the Jewish Community Center is primarily a Jewish educational instrumentality. My interest in Israel preceded anyone's concern with that. I was one of the relatively few amongst in our field who took an intense interest in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and felt that that should be incorporated within the programs. Not everyone was so minded.
But Graneum, I understand the point about being able to look into a longer time continuum than just today and see what may be necessary for the future. But how did you continue on in the face of such resistance? What made you continue rather than give up and just accept the job description that your boards of directors gave to you? I mean, why did you keep doing it?
Well, it was I don't like to use the word, it was a challenging opportunity there, but I felt that I could use either both my charm or my knowledge to influence them to take a different course, and I was happy to see that by persistence over the course of many, many years, these things came into being. So once you have done something of this nature and it's worked out satisfactorily, every time something else comes along, you add it to the elements of your own professional life and you make it come into being. And so I was never daunted by that, stuck to it. And I think the best example, obviously, is in the Ethiopian Jewish issue, when nobody was interested in it at all, and suddenly it became, but it's true that it took the better part of some 20 years, oh, maybe, yeah, some 20 years, almost 30 years, before it became, for a brief period of time, a worldwide issue, and certainly a worldwide Jewish issue. And then, of course, lapsed back into where it was before, and from which difficulties we're trying to rescue it now. But the fact that it seemed to be important, that was enough.
It was
and
important
since nobody
to you.
else was doing it, it seemed to me that that's where I ought to put my energies.
You know, that interests me that you know, you came back from Ethiopia in 1965 and been investigating and questioning this issue since 1955. So for 10 years you were looking at it. Then you went to Ethiopia, you came back, and then in 1969 the American Association for Ethiopian Jews came into being. Now you were a professional Jewish, you were a Jewish professional working in the Jewish community. You had access to all the different organizations. Why did you start your own organization rather than start a committee of federation or a committee of HIAS or you know, take another approach? What made you break away and found your own organization?
Well, I had tried that. I didn't think that there was need for another organization.
You didn't?
I thought that there were enough Jewish organizations already in existence who were better equipped than anything that I could muster to achieve this, and all I had to do was talk with them. Mm-hmm. I knew their executives by their first name. I knew many of the presidents by their first name. And I approached them in one form or another, either by going to a conference or by arranging a luncheon meeting with them, or by catching them offhand somewheres on the street or at somebody's home. There was no response. There was no interest. And then I began to think that maybe there's a whole conspiracy about it. It can't be that nobody is interested in this. Here's a beleaguered group, some, that time estimated 25 to 30,000. They are living in the highlands in poverty and filth and medical degradation, suffering from every kind of a disability, including intense discrimination and even persecution, and nobody's concerned with their welfare. Nobody goes there. Oh, a few Englishmen there, a few American tourists who went off the beaten path, but apart from that, there was no concern with their welfare. Thought something was wrong. And when a few young men from the Peace Corps came back after a sojourn in Ethiopia in '68 and '69, we got together and we created some small organization. Matter of fact, I wasn't even a member of the founding group. They incorporated it quite on their own. They just went ahead on that score, and I became part of it, but became an instrument by which we could funnel money that we were raising already for their welfare, their educational and medical welfare in Ethiopia, instead of sending the money through a roundabout way to Israel and hoping that it would eventually get there. So that's how it came into being. And once that small group was initiated, we went to the Council of Jewish Federations at their general assemblies every year, hoping to get on the agenda, but we couldn't get on the agenda. And we arranged rump meetings in which we invited. And we invited by the pamphlets that Emma and I and the Gershons of, later on the Gershons of New Orleans, and Jed Abraham, who's now in Chicago, and a few others, distributed at a General Assembly meeting, calling them to a gathering where we could tell them the inside story in the hope that something would materialize. But nothing happened. We were frustrated. We were angry. But it didn't get any results. There seemed to be a general worldwide movement, I think emanating from Israel itself, that made it impossible for any worldwide or American Jewish organization or federation to become interested in this particular concern of how to save these people from extinction.
What did your co-workers and your president, your board members at Federation say when you started devoting so much time and energy to Ethiopian Jews and founded the AAEJ?
Oh, I was able to do 8 jobs at one time. I was a one-man department. I ran community centers, I ran camps, I ran day camps, I ran Jewish education, demography studies, amongst other things. I lectured widely, I wrote, I even taught at some of the universities. I was doing this all encompassed within, as I said, a 10 to 12-hour day. As my wife said, sometimes to the neglect of my family, except we went on long vacations during the summertime. So it was no great task to incorporate it. My lifestyle of work was that before I got to my office at 9 o'clock in the morning, I had already written out on long yellow sheets of paper, lined yellow sheets of paper, enough letters, articles, and everything to keep a secretary, and I never had more than one secretary, busy for most of the day, so that I could spend my days, even when I was at the office, working with all kinds of projects. On the telephone, committee meetings, people coming to my office or going elsewhere. I think I had mentioned earlier, I was a very productive individual.
Do you regret the fact in any way that you had to form your own organization rather than get the Federation or the American Jewish Committee or HIAS to vigorously take up the issue of Ethiopian Jews?
I don't regret it. I don't regret it at all. But I would have been happier if organizations which are better endowed, better staffed, had undertaken this responsibility, and if they had done it with whole heart, the problem would have been resolved years ago.
What? Well, you can talk. What? Good. Okay. Okay.
I want to raise that. That'd be an interesting.
Okay. Well, maybe you can tie it in. I wanted to ask you about. I tried to ask you before, but I don't know if you responded. Okay.
In terms of this tape, or
Wait a second.
In terms of this afternoon.
We thought we were going to take it. It was 2 hours.
Oh, it's all right with me, but you see, Graneum could keep you busy for 8 hours.
No, I got just the questions I want to ask, so it's okay. Okay, we'll start again. I wanted to ask you if how you've suffered personally because of your promotion of the Jewish poor, birth control, integration.
Oh, very often isolated, not often invited to be a speaker. And even when I was invited to be a speaker, I wrote such provocative speeches and essays that they wouldn't print them in the professional journals. And sometimes I had to print them myself and circulated 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 copies in the professional field. Oh, there are ways of circumventing that. I wasn't invited to be part of the little controlling groups that operate in every kind of a professional society. These were limitations that we overcome by other kinds of achievements. There was time for other kinds of things. For example, in 1953, we moved into Pelham, New York. We bought a house for the first time so that we could live near a very good school to which my younger son, Michael, could go. Raymond, our oldest son, had been brought up in the Bronx by and large and went to the public school, from there on to New York University and completed his bachelor's and later his master's degree there. But Michael, who was 9 years younger, needed something better than the public schools of New York, and certainly the public high schools in the neighborhoods in which we lived. So we decided to go to the country. We hadn't lived there but a couple of months. We had met very, very few people when one morning some 30 people came to our home. They called up whether we were going to be there. They said, "We heard that you're a Jewish organizer. We have no Jewish instrumentalities in Pelham, and would you help us arrive at some kind of an organization?" Well, I thought a Jewish community center would be better than a synagogue at that point, initially, largely because the individuals who came to my home were so disparate in their views. A couple of them were Orthodox, some of them were conservative, a few of them Reformed, most of them were unaffiliated and wouldn't want to even enter and become affiliated with the synagogue itself. And so we, since I had very little time, within 1 month's time I arranged a meeting where 90 people showed up. $10,000 was collected for membership there without even a program, without even a corporate body. And somebody got up and said, we ought to raise money for a building, and $10,000 was subscribed for that as well. And a committee was set up to buy a building. And then I began to learn a lesson about the villages of Pelham where we had just come to live, that they wouldn't allow Jews to build a community center, and later on even a synagogue in the town, changing the zoning laws over and over again. I went to see the leaders of the community, both on a political level, educational level, and even as volunteers. And all of them said the same thing to me. Why don't you join synagogues in the neighboring towns? Or why, if you want a synagogue, does it have to be in prime residential areas? And I kept answering them because all of the churches are in prime residential areas. And that's where we want to be. We don't want to be over in the commercial or in the industrial part of our town. Then we finally decided to buy a building there, despite the fact that the zoning laws we knew were against us. Meetings were called by the civilians, the citizens of this town. It's a highly educated community. Corporate executives from the major corporations of America live there. Foundation board members live there. Leaders in all kinds of religious movements. And over 600 people packed into a school one night to protest our request to use this building as a synagogue. I remember walking down that aisle, and Emma was with me, and 6 other people who had the courage to do that, and we were told to go back to the Bronx or where you came from. I couldn't believe that in 1900, the year was 1958, that these kinds of sentiments could be expressed. Even in 1954, when the decision was made, the Brown decision was made about this integration of the schools in the United States, I thought by that time even America was growing to understand that its racial problems had to be resolved. But I couldn't and didn't expect that a white community could turn with such venom in the petitions to keep us out.
What year was this?
This is 58. We took them to the courts, and we lost because we didn't want to come in on charging them with discrimination against another religious group. We were advised, ill-advised, I might say, by some organizations, Jewish organizations dedicated to overcoming anti-Semitism, discrimination in the country, to not approach them on that issue so directly, but do it on overcoming the administrative order. Well, we lost in the Supreme Court. We carried it to the Court of Appeals and we lost. We carried it to the highest courts in Albany and we lost. And there we were advised to go back all over again after years of struggle, after the expenditures of all kinds of monies on our part, with no help from the outside Jewish world or all the vast number of organizations, well-staffed, well-financed. We carried it over, and this time we fought it on the basis of discrimination against our Jewish group. And we won in the Supreme Court, and they appealed this time to the appellate division. By that time, we got some friends, some Christian friends in Pelham to side with us, and they threatened to sue the villages if they continued with this what they called a lawsuit which was immoral, and the village decided to drop it.
How many years were you in court before the village dropped it?
Some 5 or 6 years.
5 or 6 years.
5 or 6 years at the court, and finally we won it.
Okay.
I wanted to
Sense.
So he was trying
even in Pelham, the people,
Yeah.
many people wanted to quit.
Right.
Some even left town. We even had Jews who were opposed to what we were doing because it would alienate them from the non-Jewish community. But I was one of those who kept on saying, you got to fight them, fight them. And we had quite a bit of support. So we maintained the morale of the community. But we had, first we had one of our own member lawyers there, and he wanted to play it cool. Don't arouse them. After all, we're going to have to live with them, even if we win, and if we lose, it's going to be even worse. So, but keeping on this thing until you ultimately won it. I can hark back to a situation at the University of Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
By chance, because I knew how to read Hebrew and the prayers and do the rituals, I was elected president of the Jewish Student Organization. I believe I have some administrative talents, and there was another small Jewish organization known there, the Menorah Society, and I proposed to them that we merge and create one larger group, which we subsequently did. And I discovered that we had 125 students on the campus. There was no Jewish faculty member in the entire university at that time, and I'm talking about 1928. And there was a very small Jewish community. There was no synagogue, no rabbi, and there was nobody, no volunteer or business person or professional of any stature there who could provide some leadership for us. And I found that I, as the president, I was the rabbi for the community. We met in the Bible College, which was a Christian institution. And so I went up to the dean by the name of Mr. Edwards one day, and I said, you know, it would be very fine if the Bible College had a faculty member who was a Jew. He could not only teach the Bible, he could teach Hebrew, he could teach perhaps other languages, ancient languages, but in addition to that, he could also be an advisor to the students. And I can still remember Dean Edwards standing up behind his desk. He hadn't sat down while I was talking to him. And I was a leader of the Jewish student body, and therefore I was a member of what they call the Interreligious Student Council. He says to me, the Christians of the state of Missouri would never stand for anything like that.
So what happened, Graneum?
So I temporarily set it aside. A couple of months later, at 11 o'clock at night, he calls me. Mr. Berger, we've just had a meeting of the body. I presented your proposal to them, and they accepted it. I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, you'll have to find $100,000, and then we'll engage a full-time professor to head that particular department who will also be your advisor. $100,000. I was a student living on about $600 a year there. We were already married at the time, and I didn't know where to turn. So I started to write to Jewish organizations, Hebrew Union College, Hillel Foundation. Everybody turned me down too. Emma and I had been married a few months before that, and so we had invited our rabbi, Rabbi Meyerberg of Kansas City, come down and speak to us. And I usually had dinner. Emma and I had dinner with the speaker of the evening, and I just offhand, I had never thought of writing to him originally, but I told him the story there. His fork and knife dropped out of his hands on the table. Young man, he says, For 25 years, we've been trying to get a faculty member on this college without success, and you've achieved a miracle. I'll have the money for you tomorrow.
And did he?
Well, he did. Called the next day, and within a couple of months, a professor, Isidore Kafitz, was engaged, who remained there for nearly 25 or 30 years thereafter.
Now, Graneum, is this luck or persistence? You achieved something that he hadn't been able to achieve for 25 years.
Persistence, being on the spot at the right time, a little luck. It's a combination. It's a complex matter, but the point is that everything became an issue. I had very little support from the students. They didn't want that kind of supervision. They didn't want that kind of intensive Jewish programming. But I felt the need for it. And of course, it was, of course, in line with the trends of the time.
Would that have happened otherwise had you not
Eventually.
persisted? Would Ethiopian Jews have been brought out of Ethiopia and brought home to Israel if you had not spoken up, if you had not pursued
Somebody
it?
might have arisen in the course of time, I don't know.
You know, I work with many people who work with Ethiopian Jews, and they feel that it would not have happened if you had not persisted, if you had not spoken
it's very, very
up.
nice to hear that. It's a possibility. Listen, one never knows what's there. The only point is somebody's got to start it at some point in time. And generally, I've always been told, well, why are you have to do things 10 or 15 or 20 years before they actually happen? I don't know. That's a divine attribute about which nobody knows what.
Have you suffered personally because of pushing for ideas 10, 20, 25 years before their time? I haven't known you very long, but in the time I have known you, you've had a family, you've been married for more than 60 years, you've raised children, you've lived in a beautiful suburb in the New York area, you've worked full-time in the Jewish community. People would look at your life and say, no, you have not suffered, you have not had to make great sacrifices to work for the causes you've worked for and achieve the things you achieved. Do you feel you've suffered personally? Of course, it's unpleasant to be told in Pelham that you could go worship elsewhere and we don't want you to worship here. But have you lost jobs? Have you? Tell me, I mean, how you feel about that.
Oh, I probably lost jobs. I probably lost other honors that might have been conferred upon me in the course of time, undoubtedly. But on the other hand, I sometimes cut myself off by dint of my own concern with the problem. For example, I will recall in 1959, I gave a paper on what I considered to be the way professionals ought to be trained for work in the Jewish community. People didn't like it. Nobody. People walked off the platform. I was assailed from the audience by it. And as a consequence of that, I, who at that time I was an officer on the way up in the professional organization, was told that I couldn't have my way and I was going against the will of the organization itself. So I quit.
Which
I
organization
resigned.
was this?
What?
Which organization was this you quit?
National National Conference of Jewish Communal Workers. Oh, in a matter of 3 years, I would have been the president of the organization. So I quit, and I always left that behind, denying myself that. There I wasn't punished, I was punishing myself, because if I had been a good boy and joined the clique and behaved myself and followed the trends of the time, rather than trying to reverse the trends that were developing there, I might have been the president of the organization.
But now that organization you quit, you withdrew from, and yet Federation you never quit, even though they didn't respond to help Ethiopian Jews. You had to go form your own organization. I mean, how do you know when to work within an existing framework or when to say goodbye, I'm going off my own, I'm going to do it regardless?
The Ethiopian Jewish issue was one that was not within Federation's framework. It belonged to an international organization, or to Israel primarily. So it didn't belong there for me to have left Federation that didn't want to support it would have been silly, because this was not the address for dealing with that particular issue. On the other hand, in Federation, I think I did suffer in some respects, but by being outspoken about Jewish education, outspoken about the fact that Federation should merge with the United Jewish Appeal, something which I advocated from the day I got into Federation in 1949 until the day that I left, and then the beginnings of the merger took place only a few months afterwards in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when necessity brought it about, something that they didn't want to do it, kept me probably from becoming maybe the executive vice president of that organization, which was the most prominent, best paid executive in the entire Jewish world. I think if I had been a good boy, minded my own P's and Q's, and if I had courted the leadership and bowed to their wishes, that might have happened, but that I couldn't do.
You couldn't do it. So you didn't get the payoff from...
No.
What payoff have you gotten from the
Payoff?
work you've done?
The only payoff is the satisfaction of seeing a project in which I was interested come to fulfillment. And I've seen so many of them in the course of a lifetime that I think that that's the best payoff. When I help create, build, find the resources, even the property, and fought, of course, with all the, then with all the architects who were building buildings that I didn't initially approve of, and they had to correct later on. And when I see this cultural arts day camp materializing, so that on the first day, when the children arrive and they go to the orchestral studio and the banks and the ballet where they were dancing, and the art studios was part of it. And later on, they added dramatics and other kinds of things, which were part of the original prospectus there. And within a matter of 2 hours, music was already beginning to come, and children were already lined up, holding on to the railings next to the mirrors and posing in their leotards. And children with brushes were already painting. There's no other satisfaction that anyone wants. This is the fulfillment of a planned vision of what the community needed. Been one of the most successful. There were I built other recreational day camps, again, that nobody wanted, but finally, when they were built, they were filled to capacity, so that we had to add one after another, a second one and a third one, perhaps a fourth one.
So nobody wanted your vision in the beginning, but you persisted.
Yep.
Because you could see it.
I persisted in two ways. One is I didn't give it up. But one of the very important things is to find the money. When you find the money for a project that you believe in, I can tell you that's the quickest way for its realization. And luckily, I was able in most instances to find some willing, generous soul who believed in what I was doing and who liked me, who'd have thought I was on the right path, and so came into being.
So you would say that for achievement, first you have to have vision?
Yeah, got to be clear about it. You have to have enough knowledge about it to make sure that you could answer almost every question that might be raised.
What else do you need to achieve things?
Oh, I think a reasonable amount of personal integrity that you can't be bought off.
Do people try to buy you off?
Always.
I've never heard this before, Graneum.
Oh, sure.
In what ways did people try to buy you off?
Well, if you're quiet, we'll introduce you to the Prime Minister. Or if we're quiet, we'll find another project that we're interested in that we'll give you a piece of, and you can work on that. Some other kind of a job, some other kind of reward. Oh, sure. People approach me. Be a nice boy.
Well, Graneum, don't you think that there were probably many worthwhile projects to help different aspects of the Jewish community or the non-Jewish community that would have been very beneficial to society and that wouldn't have upset people so much? I mean, why did you have to pursue and persist in the issues you did?
Because I'm not a routine administrator. I'm really not an administrator. I like to believe I'm a creator.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the same way you can copy art and you can make your own art. I don't never like to follow trends because I didn't think the trends were always necessarily reliable. I took data. For example, the interest in the aged. Back in 1942, I happened to be reading the census of 1940, which had just come out. And I began to note the fact that the aged were becoming an increasingly proportion of our population. You can read the literature of the 1930s and 1940s when the aged are rarely, if ever, even mentioned. While reading this report, I was looking out of my window and I saw these old folks sitting on soda box crates in front of my very building and across the street. And I began to realize that here's an agency that was serving primarily youth. Although I was interested in the entire family, we had a lot of aged people came there, but they just sat. They weren't involved. They weren't mobilized. And suddenly a new need seemed to come forth out of the air.
Tell
And
me,
that's how the idea was of recreational service, specialized recreational service of the aged was born.
And with Ethiopian Jews, you went to Kfar Batya, you saw them, you learned about them.
Then I was
You were
curiosity.
curious.
Curiosity, and I always like to find answers to questions that arise. I've never been able to solve scientific problems there. So I think one of the great deficiencies in my life, my lack of a real sound scientific background for a man living in contemporary age there. But if it is, I'm a reader. I'm a wide reader. And so I taught myself. Since I left the universities in the graduate school in 1932, I've never been back to school. I've been a teacher, mostly on a college level for many, many years, but I've been self-taught beyond that, reading hundreds of books a year of all kinds of description. If you read the articles and the speeches I made over the course of years, you'll find hundreds of quotes, sometimes thousands of quotes in a single article, with a vast variety. And it is a vast variety of reading in the subject. So generally, I know something about what I'm talking about, providing it isn't science.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You were telling me earlier about your enormous level of energy and how you felt that contributed a lot to you being able to accomplish things. Do you tell me about that again?
Well, that's something that both your family and nature endow you with. You're lucky. You don't know you've had it. But if you're healthy and well, and you can do a great deal of work, it adds enormously to your personal own productivity. And I could do so many things in a given day, ever since I was a child. Early riser, generally late to bed, reading, never wasting a moment's time. Lunch was never alone unless I was preparing something and working on it. Otherwise, I was with people trying to persuade them to do something, or I was listening to some other specialist who was telling me something about it. But you had to learn. You had to do a great many things at one time.
Graneum, why be productive? You're concerned with productivity and achievement. Why not? You worked hard. You helped people in the Jewish Federation. Did you work? Why not come home and enjoy the evening with your wife and kids, watching television, and go skiing and to the beach on weekends? And why not, after doing your contribution 40 hours during the week, why not enjoy yourself? What has driven you to achieve the number of things you have in Jewish education, working with the Jewish poor, rescuing the Ethiopian Jewish community, establishing music and arts camps for children? Why do you want to be productive?
I'm not so sure. I'll try to.
Switch tapes again.
Productive in your life. Are we rolling, guys? We're rolling. Good. Why should we be productive? Why have you been productive?
Well, implied in your question is, why did I devote most of my energies in this particular way instead of in a more rounded way? Well, I went skiing with my family during the winter time. There, we went socializing. We went on holidays together. We did, but not as much, perhaps, as a person who would have gone to work at 9 o'clock in the morning and come home at 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night and then forget about everything else. But my work was of such a nature that I saw it constantly expanding. It was always expanding. And when the opportunities were there, particularly in the post-war period, where enormous funds were available if someone was creating something that did require a great deal of money. But even in the Depression, that was equally true, and I had to save an institution from bankruptcy. And if I can tell you, if I hadn't been on Staten Island, that building would have just disappeared. I fought against the foreclosures there, made the community get enough money to ultimately make a settlement, and then carry on a program which was very respectable. So much so that in the first 6 years of my job, my first job was an executive. I never worked in anything lower than an executive position there. This small institution was changed and became also a significant one in influencing the character of much larger institutions around the country. And I built, my own reputation was built in that particular period.
But Graneum, the work you did for the Staten Island Jewish Community Center was your job. You did an extraordinary job. You did more than the job required, but it was still your assigned task to do that. Helping the Ethiopian Jewish community was something that was not within the framework of the New York Jewish Federation that you worked for, was strictly outside of your given job description, and yet you persisted and persisted to the point of even starting your own charitable organization of which you were president and is still in existence nearly 20 years later.
Well, I'll tell you a little secret. That every job that I've had, I've incorporated my own interest within it. If I was interested, obviously, in birth control, that was not part of the institution. I was an interest that I had. I thought that other people ought to be exposed to it. Therefore, brought Margaret Sanger, the leader of the movement, to the institution there. I was interested in civil rights and revolutionary movements wherever they took place, of people there. That's why I tried to bring my interest in what was going on in Spain within the center confines. I was interested in literature. And so I conducted all kinds of study groups in which I led myself, in which the reading of books, the reading of good literature, and then, of course, very often in the Jewish field, became part of it. My own interest, what I felt was good, became incorporated within that institution. In that way, you began to make part of yourself into the work that you were performing. I hope that I've made that abundantly clear. That's why the saving of Ethiopian Jews grew out of a chance meeting, of an inquisitive mind, curiosity, research, learning that somewhere or other something was rotten somewheres in the world, and the organization that could have solved it, and therefore it became part of me. It was more than a job, part of life. As a matter of fact, and Emma, my wife, has been involved in everything. Maybe I wasn't home as much as she would have liked, but she was with me in Ethiopia there. Maybe she didn't like to go skiing, but she was with me in the mountains of, whether it was in the Adirondacks or in Massachusetts, wherever else that we went skiing. She's doesn't always like to fly overseas, but she was with me in whether it was Korea or whether it was in India or whether it was in Morocco or any other part of the world. Emma was always there, so that whatever gaps there were in the time that I devoted in my own life at home, because of my preoccupation with other kinds of activities, they were made up in other ways. But incorporating the things in which I had an interest in terms of my own background, into the work that I was performing, that made the difference. That made my work even much more interesting. Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't routine, it never was a routine job. Never was a routine job. And so whenever I was approached, do I mind heading up this demographic study that Federation was undertaking, or do I mind undertaking the responsibility for training executives there? These are terribly time-consuming jobs.
Did your family suffer? Were you not able to spend as much time with your family?
They think that they suffered in some ways, but I think the enriching experience all around was good for them, good for their education. And ultimately it paid off.
So, Graneum, if you could extract from your own personal experience some general philosophy, I mean, what would you say motivates people to make a contribution to improving life for others, to improving the community or the society we live in? What motivated you? What do you think motivates people? You've mentioned the interest and the energy, but if you could just kind of address that question directly.
Well, some people believe that that I had a predisposition towards helping people, and therefore I chose this particular profession rather than something else. But that's not quite the way it happens in real life. When I was growing up, I was a very social animal. I was active in all kinds of groups. I was easily identified with the so-called intellectuals, the bright boys, the middle of the roaders, the athletes there, and also with the boys that like to chase girls. And I found that I was well-rounded enough to participate in all of them, not on always the best level. For example, I was a captain of a semi-professional basketball team when I was 16 and 17 years of age. I was not big. I was never over 5'8". In those days, I didn't weigh much more than 125, 130 pounds, but I had, at least in the minds of the other players, I had good judgment. I can reconcile their conflicts and their interests, so that young as I was, they chose me. But I also had to pay my way for being there. I turned out to be the best foul shooter anywhere around at the time. In those days, they had like a designated hitter there who hits for the pitcher. There was a designated foul shooter whenever a foul was called. And I remember one season I shot 99. I missed out on the 100th foul in succession, and that's no mean feat. Today, any professional who could shoot 99% of the fouls there would be worth his weight in gold there. So I learned that, so that I was called in as a foul shooter. In other words, I paid my way with some specialty so that I wasn't a drag, I wasn't a hindrance no matter where I was. I wasn't always the brightest intellectual, but I was gifted enough there as a reader, talker, as an analyzer, as a reconciler, so that I could join that kind of a society or be invited to it, to participate. I wasn't a great art connoisseur by any manner or means, but on Staten Island, they considered when they wanted somebody to review a book on art, they called upon me to do it. In the libraries before other groups, because I had an interest, had a broad interest in the subject. So I had a universality of interest there that made it possible. But these I always brought into the job itself.
You said in the last chapter of your book that you had a lifetime always devoted to serving rather than to personal benefit.
I don't think I quite said it that way, did I?
I love talking to you because you always remember everything. You said, a lifetime always devoted to serving what I believed were the best interests of the Jewish community rather than my personal benefit.
Well,
I have since seriously questioned the role of Jewish leadership worldwide in being able to preserve the Jewish people from extinction. But what interests me is that you chose to serve your community rather than to pursue your personal benefit. And I wonder if you can remember, or if you have any, if you're in touch with why that was so for you. Because it seems to me, at least in my generation, people in their late 30s and mid-40s are very often pursuing their personal benefit. I mean, I sit on the board of 2 charities and work for another one and deal with many of the boards of directors. And I'm usually the youngest person in the room. And I'm wondering, well, how do we make these choices to work for other people's interests rather than our own personal benefit, and why you could have gone into business, you could have pursued courses of interest to you. You know, you say that these causes just interested you. Why did those causes, the ones that were not going to deliver personal benefit to you, interest you more than areas that might have been of great personal benefit to you?
well, one of the accidents of my life is that usually I've always been the president or the executive rather than a subordinate. Oh, I've had a few temporary, short-term things where I would work under somebody there, but I was always eager to learn a great deal more. I think I've told the story in my autobiography about when I was a reporter on the Morning Herald in Gloversville, New York, and the editor and the sub-editor were both almost intoxicated every night of the week, so that I learned at the age of 18 and 19 how to turn out a paper. If it hadn't been for me staying there and going up to the speakeasy across the street and saying this letter, this article or this item just came over the wires and something, and we need a heading for it, and they would say, well, write a 3-column, 48-point, some kind of selective type that would have to go on it, and use your own judgment. Put in those positions constantly, where I had to use my own judgment since that time.
Why didn't you quit? Why didn't you say, my boss is a drunkard and I'm going to get a new job?
Because this was an opportunity. See, I saw myself, and the next morning when I read the headings on the paper, and I turned it out. And I'm only a kid. So I did it. Go to college and become president of an organization right away. And you bring in a full-time professor. I was a darling of all the professors where I was a student in their class. They would invite me to their homes. They didn't do that to other students because there was something unique about it. I was articulate. I discussed things. I was a wide reader. And several of them even made me their assistants, in which put some money in my pocket, which I badly needed at the time. So I was always in a position where I could be a leader. And when you are a leader and you're the top dog there, you don't want to go off and be a subordinate somewhere else. Well, why not seek jobs which pay a lot of money there? Well, that's another matter. You put hindrances in your way because you prefer to believe in a certain kind of cause which ultimately hurts you. I was aware of that. I took those chances there, but I hoped that the cause ultimately would be supported, which in the long run they generally were. But in the process, you didn't develop those relationships. Now, I never developed relationships consciously in order to help me, only to help a certain project get completed. That project was completed, and then it was over, and then I was on to another project, so that relationships were limited, although sometimes they were long-lasting because of the after effects. Very few executives are invited to the homes, for example, of the lay people in their organization. They meet them at meetings, but they're never invited to their homes. That wasn't my lot. I spent a great deal of time with them. And the strange thing that I found about these rich people who were in Forbes 500 and Forbes 400 or whoever they are, that they're just like me. Matter of fact, they turn to me very frequently for counsel, what to do with their children, where to send them to camp and where to send them to school, and should they give their child an automobile at the age of 16 or something of the sort. What book should they read, and what kind of friendship they have. I've sat down with the same kind of people all the time, and so I didn't see myself as being very different from them, even though they had 500 million and I had barely 30,000.
I thought you were going to say 30 million, Graneum.
So there was a difference in lifestyle, but when you spend a great deal of time with them, you find that they're not. But their drives are different. Their ambitions are different. I always believe that a man could become rich if he wanted to become rich. Then he has to devote his attention, whether the business that he's in and his investments and the firm that he runs, in order to make it rich. I made the institutions rich.
Were you never interested in riches for yourself?
I always liked to be well paid. I
you?
never thought that I was overpaid, but I would like to be well paid.
Were you well paid?
Not, I would say, in accordance with the times, yes. My salary was up to standard for the times, but not up to what my contributions were to the institutions which I worked. I understand the distinction. When I was paid at Federation, I was paid at Bronx House, and I was paid even in Staten Island. It was commensurate with what the experience was throughout the field, but not the contribution that I made to the institution of a long-lasting nature and variety, which for that they never would have had enough money to pay me.
Mm-hmm. How much time do we have left on this tape? Or can't you tell? You want to pause for a second?
A little under 10 minutes.
Do you want to? Okay.
Let's deal with the Ethiopians a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I've kind of got what I need in terms of the interview about Graham's motivation for the work he did and why people do what they do. If we have, I would like, as long as we're here and we're all set up, I'd like to talk to him about his thoughts on Ethiopian Jews, which might take longer than 10 minutes. You wanted to ask a question, though, about this topic, didn't you, Gordon?
Oh, I mean, I had just a few general
Good.
questions.
Why don't you? Yeah. Why don't you ask your questions, and I could use the last tape to spend on Ethiopian Jews.
Does this picture have any significance that we can talk about?
The picture above your head, Graneum?
Yes.
Can you talk about?
Do you know which one it is? We changed. It's that one that was over there. We moved it over here.
That's the one that Sam gave it.
This picture was given to my brother, Ambassador Samuel D. Berger, who was leading a mission of State Department officials to Ethiopia. And the ambassador at that time, by the name of Bliss, B-L-I-S-S, gave this to him. It's a picture by one of the distinguished Ethiopian artists of a group of priests. These are Coptic priests. And you see with their ceremonial dress with the drums and the staffs which are part of their. Now, Ethiopian Jewish priests, Kesim, K-E-S-I-M, are similarly robed, very often have similar garments, similar staffs to theirs, and largely because Ethiopia was originally Judaic in its character, borrowed from the priestly regimes in the ancient Israeli kingdoms. So my brother gave this to me. He thought that since I was very much interested in Ethiopia, that it would be better on my walls than his. And I was very glad to take it.
Very good. Graneum, you know, we're still working on the Ethiopian Jews. There's still 10,000 of them left in Ethiopia. It's almost 1989. What do you think needs to be done to get the remaining Ethiopian Jewish community out?
I think it has to be made a public issue. both within the Jewish and the general community. It's a task that can be very easily resolved.
Go ahead.
10,000 who were there, mostly women, small children, and elderly people. The young have either escaped or they're in the army. Their husbands also left for Israel 4 or 5 years ago, taking with them their older children at that particular time. I think it could be very easily resolved because it requires two things. First, a solemn obligation on the part of the Israelis to sit down and negotiate with Ethiopia for their emigration. Ethiopia doesn't need them. They're the poorest of the poor. They constitute a tiny fraction. I saw that the latest census is estimated at 47 million people there. They're unimportant economically, industrially, commercially. There are no doctors, lawyers, judges, scientists, technicians amongst them. They were never allowed to reach that level unless they converted to Coptic Christianity or some of the other Christian groups throughout the country, so that they're not needed. I do not believe that they're being kept there out of spite. Largely because the dominant powers and the leaders of the Jewish world have never really been interested, except temporarily, like they were in 1954 and 55 for a short period of time. And unlike any other Ethiopian group there, they have a place where they can go to. When you talk about other Ethiopians, it isn't as though that there are large Ethiopian sections in other countries. Oh, they are. The refugees are making very substantial populations, and for example, in America, and Canada, and other places, and possibly in some of the European countries. But here they have a haven that will accept them once they're allowed to get out. But on the other hand, that haven doesn't make the necessary overtures to bring this into being. This could be done through negotiations, I'm certain of it.
The foreign minister claims he's been negotiating in the last few months.
Well, that may be, but I'm skeptical how serious it is. Israel has been immersed in so many problems with the Arab revolt that's taken place within the countries which Israel conquered back in 1967, its own election campaigns, a struggle within the religious and the non-religious parties, so that their attentions could not be consumed by it. It's not on the front burners of their program. It's an afterthought where they're reminded by the pressures that are exerted by the American Association of Ethiopian Jews, either directly or through those individuals that we have persuaded that this is an important issue, like the senators and congressmen who have been important allies. That history of their contribution towards the rescue of Ethiopian Jews has never been known. Nothing like the, what was that legislative mandate that forced Russia to take action, Jackson Amendment. The Jackson hyphenated somebody else amendment that said that trade with Russia would ought to be commensurate with the release of Ethiopia, with Soviet Jews. Same kind of a deal could be worked out, and I think it'll have to be a deal. I think this is a matter that can be resolved in a single year. Whether Israel is prepared to receive another 10,000 with its present problems and its economic problems, its budgetary problems, its failure to have trained people to receive them, although this time it might be different because with some 17,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel, there are enough of them there who would step into the breach as quasi-social workers, as interpreters, as occupational aides, in every possible way, even in medicine. There are so many nurses amongst them now. They could step into everything that presented a problem when they came there over the course of recent years, so that the business of adjusting them to the country would be a modest one. I think that a lot of us would go over there and assist in every possible way, economically and professionally,
Would
in
you?
helping to bring it about. I think I would.
So what can we do here in the United States? What can American Jews
Raise hell.
specifically do?
Raise hell.
How?
Stories in the newspapers, stories in the magazine, attending every conference that we can and getting up when it's not on the agenda and making this an important issue. I don't even know whether it was raised at the last conference of the Council of Jewish Federations or not, was it?
Yes, it was.
It
And
was, yeah.
Will Recant was there, and it was on. He was not invited originally to be a speaker, and with pressure from Steve Nassiter in Chicago, he was invited to be on the panel addressing the issue of Ethiopian Jews.
Oh, I'm very glad of it. I was never invited in all the years. All the years, I was never, ever invited to a national conference there to make a presentation. I always had to sit in the audience and raise my hand and get up and approach the microphone and make my case from the floor.
How do you think the absorption's going in Israel?
If one wants to look at it dispassionately, I think it's been a remarkable absorption. I think it's been remarkable. The children have made an unparalleled, small children made an unparalleled adjustment. Within a matter of 8, 9, 10 months, certainly within a year, they're up to grade and they're in the regular classes with the other Israeli children. Now, that's no small feat in itself for youngsters who sometimes were illiterate in their own language. I'm talking about the reading and the writing of it. They do it orally. The teenagers have also done phenomenally well, particularly the youth Aliyah villages, where they've had a superb education. Every director that I've ever talked to who has a youth village where these youngsters attended had only unlimited praise as to their interest, their devotion, and their ability to master the language and the culture of which they were a part. 300 or 400 of them are now in universities or in technical schools beyond the secondary education, all doing phenomenally well from everything that I heard. There were problems originally when the first few were going there because they didn't have enough money to make a living. Some or other with this larger support, and some of them have families, they're able to get jobs, they're able to get scholarships, they've done well. Even the adults, roughly from 20 to 35 up to 40, have done fairly well in finding jobs, not always high-paying jobs, but jobs which were able to support a family. And sometimes they got some supplementation when their wages were there. There's been a problem with the older people. They haven't learned the language, they haven't learned the customs, and for them, they're going to be a burden, they're beyond relief, but they're a small minority. You want to remember that the average age of the Ethiopian Jewish population is about 18 years of age. In other words,
In Israel.
In Israel, 18 years of age. There's a problem with a large number of children who don't have families.
Tell me more about that.
Well,
What about
there were
these
estimated
kids?
about 1,500 of them did not come there with families, and for a while they had nobody to look after them. They were separated even from older siblings because of their age groups here. I think there have been some improvement in that along the line. There have even been some adoptions that have taken place, and maybe there'll be more frequently, so that a nuclear family can once more be developed from the extended families. Fathers and mothers have come in there, lost their children somewhere along the way, and were willing to take on others, even though that, the average family size outside the religious constituencies of Israel are relatively small, two-child family in the main.
Don't
Little
these
over,
children have their mothers or fathers back in Ethiopia, most of them?
Some of them do, and when they'll come, and that's one of the reasons that we're so much interested in the reunification program. There is a psychological problem of the absence of the loss of their, particularly with their parents or uncles and aunts there, from which they suffer. Perhaps that's the most pronounced burden, psychological burden that they have to deal with. But even that, there's been relatively little pathology amongst them. There was an outcry among suicides, so that there were 25 or 30 suicides, maybe as many as 30. I've never heard any figures beyond 30. Well, that's insignificant compared to the number of suicides that took place amongst the German refugees that came there in the 30s and 40s. Yes, I heard that from German Jewish psychologists. What are they talking about, suicides? There were by the hundreds, and perhaps even thousands took place both in Germany and Austria and Poland before they left and after they came there. Almost little or no crime amongst them. There have been problems of divorce, the separation, the differences in style, the achievements of the girls as against the women as against the men, who completely outgrew them, and their opportunities which were opened up to has brought about some disruption in family life. But even that is relatively small numerically, so that none of these problems are that serious. And growingly, they're becoming part and parcel Israelis in every sense of the word. Even the question of marriage, as I see by the recent press, only the last week or so in the Jerusalem Post, is being resolved. The Kessim will be able to marry them, and their rabbis will be able to marry them when there's assurance that they are both Ethiopian and legitimate Ethiopian Jews, which is a fair test. But they don't have to go through any indignities of a drop of blood, or do they have to go through any other conversionary rites in order to establish their Jewishness. I think the adjustment has been pretty good. Should there be continued economic decline, a continued economic decline in Israel, then they may suffer the loss of jobs. But there's also the relief department, which steps in even there to take over at this particular point. I don't see any serious problems. I even know of intermarriages taking place with a white, few, not pronounced, few. They're marrying other ethnic groups who are not necessarily white, Indians, Iraqi, Yemenites, and others, so that there's they're doing what most of the Israelis are doing in that particular pattern. I think the prospects for them are as good as they are for the general population.
So, as American Jews, I mean, should we just sit back and believe in quiet diplomacy? Or,
well, I've never believed in quiet diplomacy. As you well know, I've always been outspoken, and I think that every time we made an effort to bring this to the attention of the public, either through publicity, sometimes over television. For example, I still do not believe that Operation Moses would have taken place if all the events of 1954 had not preceded it. The film that came out on the Falashas.
1984.
I'm sorry, what did I say?
Just 54.
I'm sorry, 1984,
okay.
right. I don't want to...
No, I just want you to say 84 so I can edit it
like,
in there.
Mr. Bush about the date of
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
Just start your sentence again. You don't believe that Operation Moses would have
taken
occurred
place if the events of '84 had been different. The publishing and printing of course, of the film Falasha. Whether it was shown as much as it was, but its very presence, the threat of its being there, had a disturbing effect and forced action on it sooner. The NBC film that came out in June of 1984, which was only 20 minutes but had also a very pronounced effect about it. People knew about it. very quickly.
Which film was that, Graneum?
NBC had a film, 20 minutes. That's where I'm interviewed by Delaney on it, and I had must have been about 40 seconds on, maybe a minute or so on there, even though I came in and spent a whole day in the house. But that film was a very important element. The congressional leaders who began to bring pressure upon the Israelis on that score. And finally, the famine. The famine and the presence every night on the radio and television about their presence in Sudan, all of these things forced the issue. Israel became aware of it in a way which they just couldn't discount it. And as a consequence, they hurriedly put together the script in October and November and marshaled the forces with great assistance from the American government and brought about the rescue of some 8,000 people. Never would have taken place without that concentration of forces month after month. There were editorials in op-ed pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. We had brought people from Israel, Ethiopia, Jews here to speak around the country. 1954 was the year that lit the match that ultimately led to this triumphant, mixed metaphor, it's true, but led to the triumphal entry of them into the country.
Gordon, are we picking up Emma's words or not in the other room?
Not the words, probably the telephone.
Oh, the telephone, definitely.
Okay. Do you want to ask your questions to Graneum now? Or should we wait till Emma gets off the phone?
Sure, I'll just ask them now. I mean, they're
Okay.
basically getting back to you rather than the Ethiopian chief.
No, this is good, yeah.
When you do respond, though, can you switch seats then with Gordon? Or
Sure.
You want to sit here?
That's all right. I'll just stand over here. No, that's fine.
Okay. No, Gordon, you want to speak in this microphone?
I don't think that's
doesn't
necessary.
matter. We're not going to hear your voice probably anyhow. Okay.
And getting back to you,
you can just look at Susan when you respond, though.
are you a rebel?
Am I a rebel? Oh, I think I have a strong rebellious spirit as part of my being.
How else do you see yourself? What other qualities? I mean, I think that in some sense people need to define themselves a little bit to keep going and to pursue their interests and their desires in the face of adversity. How did you define yourself, and how do you define yourself in those terms? Did you have to?
Oh, I'm outraged at injustices. I always have been, and when they occur, I make my views evident with candor and forthrightness, and without equivocation. You know where I stand. In this recent election, I was an out-and-out Dukakis and anti-Bush fan, and wherever I went, every dinner party, every meeting, every telephone conversation, every letter that came into it, and I know I persuaded a great many people to change their votes there from one to another. In other words, when there's an issue in which I am concerned there, it becomes part and parcel of everything that I do. I'm a letter writer, 4, 5, 6, 7 letters a day that go out to friends all over the world, and I make my views known to them the same way in every forum where I speak. I do the same thing, so that what I believe in, I articulate. And whether I win converts or not is immaterial, but they know exactly where I stand.
Why do you think inequity outrages you? Why do you think that inequity outrages you?
I don't know whether it's part of my familial heritage. It was a topic of conversation in our family. My father used to read the Yiddish papers when we were children every day. We all came home for lunch. That was lunch, it was dinner. The big meal was at dinner time. And he read the papers and would inform us what was going on in the world, so we knew it. My father was a Democrat in a town where everybody was Republican. So maybe he was. And he himself was, in some respects, rebellious in his own positions as a member of the Jewish community of which he was a part. He was always attacking any kind of corruption that existed in any organization in which he was getting. And he was a very righteous. I'm not saying this out of any desire to sentimentalize, but he happened to be a very just businessman who forgave other people's debts, who staked people into business that they didn't repay. And some of this rubbed off. My mother was a very charitable woman. She could be a tough dame in the treatment of other people too, but every time when she was well, and she would be in the hospitals visiting the sick and visiting the poor, and arranging to give them money and coal and other kinds of things when they were in distress. So a little of this rubs off. How much, I don't know. You're not aware of it, but it becomes part of it. Then part of my own analysis of the situation, I make up my own mind where I stand before I read the New York Times to find out whether it conforms. It does conform. I read all kinds of magazines. So I come to my own opinions, but injustice is something that I've just been abhorrent of. I learned to meet black people when I was a child. I was a drummer in a band. How old was I? 13, 14, 15, an orchestra. Our musician was a black man. When we went out on to play, very often we stayed overnight, and we were always given hotels and bedrooms where we had to sleep two in a bed. And I always seemed to, he always seemed to be assigned to me, or maybe they were gravitated. So I mean, I've had that intimacy. At the university, I heard about a lynching. I rushed down to town, and too late to see, but it was a memorable thing in my mind. I couldn't get it out of my mind. Then there was an epidemic of smallpox in town, and they weren't willing to vaccinate the black people. This is in the 1920s, when in Missouri, I was in the University of Missouri, which was a separated state. And some of us went to appeal to the medical authorities, a few of us, that you've got to vaccinate them, because if you don't, it'll infect us. That was the only appeal that we could make to them. It wasn't on the basis of human rights. And as a consequence, they changed it, and they did that. So I learned the effect of pressures upon public officials very, very early. And I've always been interested when blacks were beginning to come into the Bronx, and I was part of it and coming in our community. I went out of my way to educate the white community there with the best of the blacks, the finest artists, the finest musicians, speakers, public people there, so that they could see that not every black youngster was a criminal. This is before drug addiction and before the other kinds of things. So that my concern. We're at the end of the tape?
Yeah, we're going to change the tape.
Yeah. But the point I make this.
So finish up what you were saying to Gordon.
Yeah. Is it on?
It's on.
What I was saying, that the certain experiences that you have get incorporated into your psyche in ways that you can't always interpret and evaluate how they become part of it. Do you get involved there simply because you want to be a hero? No. I'm not interested in being a hero, although I have a lot of courage that I'm not afraid to stand up to anybody. One of my mottos in my book is put not thy faith in princesses. I don't have any. As I said, when I dealt with rich people, I found that they weren't any different than I was. They weren't any better than I was. I don't consider politicians any better than I was. I don't heroize them in any fashion. They're individuals who are subject to the same kind of pressures. Now, once you make that kind of determination and don't have any gods or idols that you worship per se, then you could devote yourself to the cause which has to be eliminated. deal with it. That's how I generally have gotten involved. I always try to get to the root of it. If I'm in a position, I'm on a committee.
What or who does or did inspire you?
I don't know. I wrote about my chance meeting for a day with Clarence Darrow back in spring of 1927. Clarence Darrow mean anything to you,
Oh, yeah.
people? He was a great attorney. He was in the famous Tennessee monkey trial case dealing with creationism as against Darwinism. And also he defended the Loeb and Leppold young boys and got them all from the chair, which I'm not so sure that he did the right thing, but he introduced the psychiatric insanity plea temporarily, and that's where I had suggested that he be invited to Gloversville, New York as a major speaker, because the chairman of the committee said, well, who can we bring here that'll pack them in? That was the expression that he used. The chairman was a man who owned a great many theaters, or trying to get things to pack him in. So I suggested Clarence Darrow. Well, when he came to town, I was part of the committee that went down to meet him. And then we had lunch, and we took him back to the hotel. And at the hotel, he said, young man, I want you to stay with me. How old was I? 18 years old at the time. I want you to stay with me. What do you want to say? Where can I get some real beer? So I said, all right, Mr. Darrow. I went across the street to a speakeasy and got him some real beer and sat with him all afternoon talking. He was lying on his bed there with his galluses and everything, just as he's pictured in the rumpled suit. And we talked, amongst many things. And one of the things that I said is that when he asked me what I look for in my career, I said, I think maybe I'll be a journalist. I was a newspaperman at the time. And he said, well, you have to go to college for that. I said, no. I said, that fellow from the Baltimore Sun who covered you at the Tennessee trials, I said, he never went to college. And besides that, you never went to college either, Mr. Darrow. I checked up on him. He read law in the book there. He says, well, that was a long time ago. He was already a man in his 70s. He says, the future belongs to people who finish their university education. He had an influence on me. Now, we were together roughly from 12 o'clock until 7 o'clock that day. I wrote a 8-column story about him for the paper the following morning. But I've never forgotten Clarence Darrow. Outside of that, I've had a few great teachers, Dr. Salo Barone and Dr. Mordecai Kaplan, whom I studied, probably the two most seminal minds of the Jewish 20th century. I spent 2 years studying with them, and they both liked me. And they both had an influence upon certainly my Jewish education. But they wasn't transformed, in terms of neither a direction. I didn't become a rabbi or a historian or a scholar there, except on my own. So I don't know. I don't know what are the forces that operated. I try to discover that in the writing of a book. Who were the people who really influenced you in some given direction? Something came up. I was actually at the university, I was going to be a teacher, a high school teacher, no less, possibly a college teacher. The best job that I was offered was in Independence, Missouri, to teach four subjects and coach the basketball team, because I put down that I had basketball experience there, for $600 a year. Well, I was married and had a son, couldn't make a living. Along comes a recruit for a social work school, and they told me if I took an examination, I might be eligible for a $2,000 a year fellowship. I took the exam and won the fellowship, even though I had had almost no sociological or psychological. I had 2 or 3 courses, that's all I had. My field is literature, history, philosophy, and art. It was really in the humanities. So I shifted in 1930, at the onset of the Depression, to a completely different field where I had had a knowledge of it through my parents, my belonging to a YMHA, my presidency of the Jewish student organizations, but I never had any technical skills. I got to be, and I finished studying, I became an executive in my first agency, in a bankrupt agency, where I had to learn law, I had to learn building construction, there I had to learn management, I had to learn how to finance and budgeting, none of which I had been trained in. I learned all those things, and publicity is one thing that I had known a little bit about. So I had to learn a whole new field in a relatively short time in order to save it. Now, what drives you to learn it? I used to get accountants and sit with them by the hour and pull their minds apart so I could learn it, not using them necessarily because I couldn't trust them all the time. So this is the way one human being grew up. But I always pulled from the past. As I said, in Staten Island, I used my knowledge of the arts, music, dance, drama, fine arts, literature, and everything, incorporated in the institution. I used to say, I don't have to go to New York to see those things. I brought the theater there. I brought the artist into the organization there. They didn't have any time or money to travel to go elsewhere, so that became there. And although we were much better off when I got to Bronx House, even Bronx House became a place for wonderful shows, wonderful art shows, wonderful concerts, wonderful plays. Everybody turned to us and looked to us as an institution which this kind of thing could emanate. And I wanted to be there. Well, it gave distinction to the agency, there's no doubt about it, but it also gave me an opportunity to participate in the things that I liked. And so that's the way it happened.
I have one more question. I just like to, it seems to me, I think that you've been very lucky in that you've been able to create, at least in microcosm, a type of society which you might envision as ideal as opposed to the way reality is. Would you agree with that?
No, I never believed that there's an ideal society. I've read all of the utopias there. Even wrote a little story, Marriage a la Moore. You know, Moore wrote Utopia there, in which a young man and a girl are being led up to the altar to get married, and when the minister says to him, "Would you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" he leaps back into Moore's Utopia. And he says, "What am I doing? I don't know this woman." In Moore's Utopia, when a man bought a horse, he looked at him. He opened his mouth. He opened his craw. He lifted his tail. He lifted up his legs to see what the body in there was. And he didn't know this woman. He had never seen her naked. I use that symbolically in terms of, you know. So he ran. He left the church and ran. But he loved the woman. And every night he haunted her house, hoping that somewhere or other, maybe she would leave the shade up, the curtain up, so that when she prepared for bed, he could see her and all. And one night this happened, and so he saw her naked. She turned, twisted, and everything else, and he saw her whole body. Rushed in, took her off, and then they got married. I wrote that little story, Marriage a la Moore.
What year did you write this in? Because this wouldn't happen nowadays.
1928. The professor who wrote back on it, and he said, learn how to walk before you run. That's kind of an evaluation that he gave it. He didn't think very much of the story.
But I think
but you asked me
you
about
understand what
utopias.
Gordon's asking.
I never believed that there could be a perfect world, because man essentially is an imperfect human being in terms of even my evaluation. I know all my own shortcomings. But on the other hand, there's a prophetic saying amongst our sages that when you're in this world, you're bound to help improve it. You can't complete the task the way it's put, but you cannot desist from doing something about it. So you have to do whatever you can to make it a little bit better. the things that you touch. That is in the globular world, but you can do it through institutions. I have been recently meeting and writing to young men, kids, who came under my sway as kids. One is now a Supreme Court judge in Louisiana, and one is a dean of School of Social Work in Berkeley, and another is a executive vice president of ABC there. There are other deans, other college professors in one form or another. I've been trying to get them to sit down and write their autobiographies. How did your life at Bronx House influence you in a way? These were the poorest of the poor, sometimes without any families there. So, and most of them want to give me much more credit than I deserve for it, even though we adopted it. No, I say that quite candidly. There's an institutional framework which we provided. We were the substitute parents, an institution. I wasn't the only one that had an impact upon their lives. So then, in that sense, you find that you can influence a lot of people. I want them, I've got some remarkable autobiographies, candid as the devil, telling all of the troubles in their families and the horrible conditions under which their families lived, suicides and divorce and separation and institutionalization and everything else on the sun. And these boys emerged from it. And I say largely through the help of an institution there. So in every way, one can be somewhat useful, and you never know eventually how it will all end. Not successful to everybody, but with more people than you think. So in that way, try to make it somewhat better, but unhappily not perfect.
Fair enough. Well, that's all I've got to say.
I think that's good. I think I've got plenty of material to